The dust had a taste out here, a fine grit that settled on the tongue as surely as it settled on the windowsill. Eleanor swiped a finger through it, leaving a clean streak in the gray film. It was the taste of her life, dry, flavorless, and unchanging. Outside, the California hills were the color of a lion's pelt, baked brown and brittle under a sky so vast and empty it seemed to press down on the land, squeezing the life from it. The few oaks that clung to the slopes were gnarled and tired, their leaves withered before they had a chance to fall. This was the only world she had ever known. This small homestead her father had carved out of the wilderness, a place so far from the town of redemption that a trip for supplies was a 2-day affair. It was a world of isolation, a kingdom of sun-bleached wood and looming silence, and she was its captive princess. At 19, Eleanor had learned that silence was a daughter's finest virtue. Her father, Jebediah, was a man carved from the same hard rock as the surrounding hills. His words were few and sharp, tools he used to shape his world, and she, his only child, was simply another part of it to be managed. He had never spoken a word of affection to her that she could recall. Praise was a nod for a well-cooked meal. Disappointment was a tightening of his jaw that made the lines around his mouth look like deep cracks in dry earth. He saw her not as a daughter, but as an asset, a piece of property whose value had finally matured. The proof of that transaction hung on a hook on the back of her bedroom door. The wedding dress. It was made of simple white cotton, not lace and silk, for such fineries were an indulgence the homestead could not afford, and her future husband would not appreciate. Mr. Silas Croft was a man of practicalities, a rancher, widowed these past 3 years, with a spread 5 times the size of her father's land and an age that was more than double hers. Jebediah had announced the arrangement a month ago over the dinner table, the same way he might announce the sale of a calf. "Silas Croft has made an offer for you," he had said, not looking at her. "You'll be married next month. It is a good match. His land borders ours to the east." Eleanor had not protested. The thought had flickered in her mind, a tiny, rebellious spark, but it was extinguished as quickly as it appeared. Where would she run? What would she do? She knew how to cook, to sew, to tend a small garden, and to be silent. The world did not value such skills in a woman on her own. Her mother, Martha, had offered a fleeting, pitying glance from across the table, her own face a mask of weary resignation, but she had said nothing. She had learned long ago that her husband's word was law, as unchangeable as the setting sun, and so Eleanor's future was sealed. She would belong to Mr. Croft, tend to his house, and warm his bed until she, too, was as worn and tired as the land around her. She ran her hand down the sleeve of the dress. The cotton was cool and smooth beneath her fingers. She did not love Mr. Croft. She barely knew the man, having met him only 3 times. He was stout and gray, with hands like butcher's slabs and eyes that assessed her with a flat, possessive gaze. He smelled of livestock and stale tobacco. The thought of him touching her, of being his wife in every sense of the word, sent a cold dread through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. But she believed, with the certainty of a lifetime of obedience, that she had no say in the matter. Her will was not her own. It belonged to her father, and soon it would belong to her husband. That night, the last night she would sleep in this small room as Eleanor Vance. The air was unnaturally still. The usual chorus of crickets was silent, and no breeze stirred the dying leaves on the trees. She lay in her narrow bed, staring into the darkness, the wedding dress a pale ghost in the corner of her eye. Sleep would not come. Her mind circled around the same bleak thoughts, a vulture circling a carcass. The life she had known was over, and the one that awaited her felt like a cage. She finally drifted into a restless doze, her dreams filled with images of gray hills that stretched on forever, with no horizon in sight. She woke to the smell first, acrid and sharp. It clawed at the back of her throat, a scent wholly alien to the clean, dry air of the hills, smoke, thick and oily. Her eyes snapped open to a terrifying, flickering orange light that danced and pulsed outside her small window. For a moment, her mind refused to comprehend. Then, a loud crack, like a giant whip snapping, echoed through the house, followed by the roar of a monstrous, hungry beast. Fire! Panic seized her, cold and sharp. She threw off the thin blanket and scrambled out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor. The heat was already palpable, pressing in on her, stealing the air from her lungs. She stumbled to her door and twisted the knob. It was hot to the touch. She wrenched it open and was met by a solid wall of black smoke that billowed into her room, choking her, blinding her. She could hear the fire now, a deafening, all-consuming roar. It was eating her home. "Father!" she screamed, her voice swallowed by the noise. "Mother!" She dropped to the floor, where the air was clearer, and crawled out into the narrow hallway. The orange glow was brighter here, the heat intense. The front of the house, the main room where her parents slept, was a furnace of swirling flame. She could see timbers, glowing red, falling from the ceiling. There was no way through. She could not reach them. They could not reach her. Another scream tore from her throat, a raw, desperate sound of pure terror. The smoke was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered her, filling her mouth and nose with soot. Her eyes burned, and tears streamed down her face. She turned, disoriented, trying to crawl back toward her room, thinking of the window. But the layout of the small house was a confusing maze in the dark and the smoke. The roar of the fire was in her ears, in her head, the only sound in the universe. It was the sound of the world ending. Her hand touched the wall, and the wood was blistering hot. She recoiled with a cry of pain. The fire was everywhere. It was beneath the floor, in the walls, above her head. She was inside the belly of the beast. The heat intensified, a searing, unbearable wave that felt as if it were peeling her skin from her bones. Her nightgown, the same thin cotton as her wedding dress, seemed to melt against her back and arms. An agony unlike anything she had ever imagined ripped through her, and she screamed again and again. But her cries were nothing against the inferno's roar. They were just whispers swallowed by the flames. The world dissolved into a blur of orange and black, a symphony of pain. And then, mercifully, there was only darkness. Colt had made his camp a few miles away, in a small hollow that offered some protection from the wind. He was passing through, on his way north, with no particular destination in mind. He preferred it that way. Destinations meant people, and people meant complications. He had his horse, his saddle, and the few possessions on his pack mule. It was enough. He was sitting by the low embers of his fire, nursing a cup of tin coffee, when he saw it, a flicker of light on the crest of the hill, too bright and too frantic to be a campfire or a lantern. It grew with impossible speed, a malignant orange blossom blooming against the black velvet of the night sky. He set his cup down and stood up, his body tensing. He had seen enough fires in his life to know what he was looking at. A house fire, and one that was moving fast. He quickly doused his own embers, saddled his horse with swift, economical movements, and swung himself up. He was a man who rarely interfered in the business of others, a man who had learned the hard way that trouble was best avoided. But this was different. This was not a bar fight or a land dispute. This was a pyre, and there might be people inside. He urged his horse into a gallop, the animal's powerful legs eating up the dry ground. As he got closer, he could hear the roar and feel the heat radiating through the air. The homestead was completely engulfed, a skeletal frame of burning timber outlined against the flames. The roof was already collapsing inward, sending a shower of sparks and embers high into the air. It was a lost cause. No one could have survived that. Still, something compelled him to circle the inferno, his eyes straining through the smoke and the blinding light. It was then he saw a section of the back wall, where a small bedroom might have been. that had not yet been completely consumed. It was a long shot, a fool's errand. His every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to stay back, to let it burn. But another voice, a deeper, older one he had tried to silence for years, whispered of failure and regret. He would not stand by and do nothing. Not again. He dismounted. Grabbing the small axe from his saddle, he tied his bandana over his nose and mouth and ran toward the burning structure. The heat was a physical blow, staggering him. He kicked at the door, but it was jammed tight. He swung the axe, the blade biting deep into the hot wood. Once, twice, 3 times. The wood splintered and broke. He kicked the shattered remnants of the door in and plunged into the smoke-filled room. It was like stepping into hell. The air was unbreathable, a toxic soup of smoke and superheated gas. He could see almost nothing. He dropped to his hands and knees, feeling his way across the floor. His hand brushed against something soft, fabric. He followed it and found her, a small, still form lying on the floor. He did not know if she was alive or dead. There was no time to check. He hooked his arms under hers, ignoring the way the burned fabric of her nightgown felt, and began to drag her toward the opening he had made. The roof groaned above them. He pulled harder, his lungs burning, his eyes streaming. He was halfway out the door when a section of the ceiling gave way behind them with a deafening crash, showering them with a cascade of fiery debris. A glowing ember landed on his shoulder, burning through his shirt and searing his skin. But he did not stop. He dragged her clear of the house, out into the relative cool of the night, collapsing onto the dirt beside her, gasping for air. He rolled her gently onto her unburned side. Her hair was singed, her face smudged with soot, but it was her back, her arms, and the side of her body that had taken the worst of the fire. The sight made his stomach clench. She was alive, her breathing shallow and ragged, but she was hurt worse than anyone he had ever seen who still drew breath. He looked back at the house. It was a funeral pyre now, collapsing in on itself, consuming everything within. Her parents, he presumed. There was no hope for them. He was alone with the girl, a dying girl in the middle of nowhere. Town was a day's ride, maybe more. She would never make it. There was only one other option, his cabin. It was a full night's ride into the hills, hidden and remote, but it was closer than town, and it was the only shelter he could offer. He made his decision quickly. He retrieved his canteen and gently washed the soot from her face, then wrapped her as carefully as he could in his bedroll, trying to cover the terrible wounds without touching them directly. Lifting her was a delicate, painful process. He could feel the heat still radiating from her body. He laid her across the front of his saddle, mounted behind her, and, leading his pack mule, turned his horse away from the fire and into the darkness of the hills. He did not look back. For days, she drifted in a sea of darkness, a place without time or thought, where the only reality was a dull, persistent ache that throbbed in the deep. Sometimes, the darkness would thin, and she would surface into a world of agonizing, sharp-edged pain. In those brief moments of semi-consciousness, she was aware of sensations: a cool cloth on her forehead, the bitter taste of herbs on her tongue, the gentle but firm touch of hands changing the dressings that seemed to cover her entire body. She would hear the crackle of a fire nearby and the soft tread of boots on a wooden floor. A presence was there, a quiet, constant shadow in the periphery of her pain. Then the darkness would reclaim her, pulling her back under its merciful waves. When she finally woke for good, it was not to the scent of smoke, but to the clean smell of pine and wood smoke. The pain was the first thing she recognized. It was a living entity, a fire that burned not on her skin, but under it. Every breath was a trial, every slight movement a fresh wave of agony. She opened her eyes. The light was soft, filtered through a single, clean window. She was in a small, simple room, a cabin, lying on a narrow cot. A rough spun blanket covered her. Across the room, a man sat in a wooden chair, sharpening a knife with a whetstone. He was broad-shouldered, with dark, unruly hair and a face that was all angles and shadows in the dim light. He wore a simple flannel shirt and denim trousers. He looked up when she stirred, his hands stilling. His eyes were a startlingly clear gray, and they held a deep, unreadable weariness. He was the man from her fever dreams. The shadow, fear, cold and immediate, tightened her chest. She tried to sit up, but a fresh explosion of pain across her back and arms threw her back against the cot with a gasp. "Easy." The man's voice was low and rough, like stones rubbing together. "Don't try to move." "Where?" Her own voice was a dry, rasping whisper she barely recognized. Her throat felt raw. "My cabin," he said, setting the knife and stone aside. He stood and walked to the hearth, where a pot simmered over the fire. "You're safe here." He ladled some broth into a bowl and brought it to her, along with a cup of water. He had to help her sit up, his arm supporting her, his touch careful to avoid the bandages that encased her torso and arms. He held the cup to her lips, and she drank greedily. The questions swirled in her mind, a frantic, confused jumble. The fire, her home, her parents. She looked at the man, at his grim, quiet face. "My father? My mother?" she whispered, dreading the answer. The man's gaze did not waver, but a shadow passed through his gray eyes. "The house is gone," he said, his voice gentle but direct. "There was nothing, no one else I could get to." The words did not hit her at first. They were just sounds. The house is gone. No one else. Then the meaning crashed down upon her, a weight so immense it crushed the air from her lungs. Gone. They were gone. Her stern father, her silent mother, her whole world, consumed by fire. A sob, dry and ragged, escaped her lips, but the tears would not come. She was too empty, too hollowed out by pain and shock. She became aware, then, of the bandages. They were everywhere. Thick layers of clean cloth wrapped around her left arm, from shoulder to wrist, across her entire back, and around her side. Her right arm was blessedly free, but when she lifted her hand, it trembled uncontrollably. Slowly, hesitantly, she brought her shaking fingers to the bandages on her other arm. She could feel the heat of the wounds through the cloth and the unnatural, puffy texture of the skin beneath. A wave of nausea and terror washed over her. She did not want to see. She could not bear to know the extent of the damage. Her gaze darted around the small cabin, looking for a mirror, a reflection in the window pane. Anything. There was nothing. It was as if he had deliberately removed any way for her to see herself. In the days that followed, a quiet, monotonous rhythm established itself. Colt. She learned his name when he spoke it once. A simple, unadorned offering, tended to her with a silent, methodical care. He rarely spoke more than a few words at a time. Time for this. Drink. Try to eat. He would boil herbs that filled the cabin with a pungent, medicinal smell and gently apply the cooling salves to her wounds. The process of changing her dressings was an ordeal of silent, shared agony. He was efficient and professional, his hands surprisingly gentle, and he never, ever let his eyes linger on the raw, burned flesh for a moment longer than necessary. It was a small act of grace, a shielding of her from his pity or disgust, and she was profoundly grateful for it. The nights were the worst. Sleep offered no escape, only a different kind of hell. She dreamed of fire. She was trapped in the hallway again, the roar of the flames in her ears, the searing heat on her skin. She would scream for her parents, her throat raw, but they would never answer. She would wake up with a strangled gasp, her body drenched in a cold sweat, silent tears tracking paths through the soot that still faintly clung to her cheeks. She never screamed out loud. The cries were trapped inside her, but he always knew. She would open her eyes to see him sitting in the chair across the room, a silent, solid silhouette in the dying firelight. He would not speak, would not offer empty platitudes or comforting lies. He would just sit there, a quiet guardian, his presence a strange and unexpected anchor in her terrifying new world. And he would stay until the shaking subsided and she drifted back into an exhausted, dreamless sleep. Weeks bled into a month. The raw, searing pain of Eleanor's burns slowly subsided into a deep, constant ache, a fiery map of her trauma that was now a permanent part of her geography. Colt had been forced to ride to the town of Redemption for supplies, salt, flour, and more of the precious linen for her bandages. He was gone for 3 days, and in his absence, the silence of the cabin pressed in on Eleanor, a heavy, suffocating weight. It was a different silence from the one she had shared with him. His was a quiet, filled with presence, a steady, watchful calm. This was a silence of pure emptiness, a void that echoed with the ghosts of the fire and the life she had lost. When he returned, his expression was harder, the lines around his mouth etched deeper than before. He unpacked the supplies without a word, his movements clipped and precise. He did not tell her what he had learned in town, but she could feel it in the air between them, a new tension, a darkness brought back from the world of men. But news, like water, always finds a way to flow, even to the most isolated of places. It trickles down from gossip, carried on the winds of speculation and judgment. The story of the Vance homestead fire had reached redemption, and it had twisted and warped in the telling. Silas Croft, the jilted bridegroom, had seen to that. Furious at the loss of his bride and the property she represented, he had painted a picture for the townsfolk, a venomous narrative that protected his pride. The girl, he claimed, was willful and unstable. She had never wanted the match. She must have set the fire herself, a desperate, mad act to escape her duty, and had run off. That she had been found, burned but alive, only added a layer of wickedness to the tale. She was not a victim. She was a cunning fugitive who had gotten her just deserts. And so the whispers began. In the general store, over laundry lines, in the pews on Sunday, they spoke of the burned girl hidden in the hills, damaged goods, unmarriageable. Her scars were not a mark of tragedy, but a brand of her sin. She was cursed, some said. Others, more charitable, simply called her mad. The pity they might have felt for an orphan was curdled by suspicion and a morbid, fearful curiosity about her disfigurement. Eleanor Vance, the quiet, obedient girl, had been erased. In her place was a monster, a cautionary tale whispered to disobedient daughters. Eleanor knew none of the specifics, but she felt the shadow of them in Colt's mood. It confirmed a truth that had been taking root in her heart. The world she had known was gone, and it would not welcome her back. This small, rustic cabin was now her entire world, and the silent man who moved within it was her only human contact. Her body, at least, was slowly mending. The skin was beginning to knit itself back together in puckered, angry welts. Colt encouraged her to move, his voice soft but firm. "You need to walk," he would say, helping her to her feet. The first time she stood, the cabin tilted violently, and a wave of dizziness and pain sent her stumbling back onto the cot. But she tried again the next day, and the day after that. Slowly, painfully, she began to walk again. Her first steps were a shuffling, hesitant journey from the cot to the hearth, her body wrapped in cloth and agony. Her left arm was stiff, her back a solid plank of tight, unforgiving scar tissue. Every movement was a negotiation with pain, but with each step, a tiny flicker of her old self returned. She was more than just a body lying on a cot, waiting to be tended to. She could move, she could stand, she could exist. Colt would watch her, his gray eyes missing nothing. "Stretch," he would command gently, showing her how to slowly raise her good arm, how to gently twist her torso. He never pushed her too hard, But he never let her give up. He brought her small bowls of stew, venison he had hunted, and made sure she ate. Even when grief and pain stole her appetite, he was not kind in the way of soft words or gentle smiles, but in the steady, practical application of his will to see her live. The day she saw herself happened by accident. It was late afternoon, and a rare rainstorm had washed the dust from the air, leaving the world outside the window clean and glistening. Colt was outside, chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of his axe a familiar, comforting beat. Eleanor had walked to the window, leaning against the frame for support, watching the last of the raindrops drip from the pine needles. The light was fading, turning the window pane into a dark, reflective surface, and for the first time in over a month, she saw her own reflection. It was a stranger. A gaunt, hollow-eyed creature stared back at her. Her face, untouched by the flames, was pale and thin, but it was not her face that held her captive. It was the shape of her. Through the thin fabric of the shirt Colt had given her, she could see the distorted outline of her body. Her left shoulder was drawn inward, and the arm hung at an unnatural angle, held rigid by the tightened, scarred skin. The entire left side of her torso was a lumpy, uneven mass. She was twisted, deformed. A sound, a low, guttural moan, escaped her lips. The image in the glass did not flinch. It was her. This was her now. This broken, ruined thing. The strength she had so painstakingly gathered over the past weeks evaporated in an instant. Her legs gave way, and she slid down the wall to the floor, collapsing into a heap. Sobs racked her body, violent, silent spasms of grief and horror that seemed to be torn from the very depths of her soul. She was ugly, a monster. The whispers of the town, which she had not even heard, were true. Who could look at her without revulsion? Who could ever touch this mangled body with anything but pity or disgust? She curled into a tight ball on the floor, her good arm wrapped around her head. Trying to hide from the image still burned into her mind, she lay there, trembling, as the last of the light faded from the sky, leaving the cabin in shadows. The sound of the cabin door opening startled her. Colt stood there, silhouetted against the gray twilight, a bundle of firewood in his arms. He stopped dead when he saw her on the floor. He dropped the wood with a clatter and was across the small room in 2 strides, kneeling beside her. "Eleanor, are you hurt?" His voice was rough with concern. She could not speak, could only shake her head, her face buried in her knees. The sobs had subsided into a continuous, uncontrollable trembling. He understood immediately. His gaze flicked to the darkened window pane, and a look of pained comprehension crossed his face. He had tried to protect her from this, but the world had too many mirrors. He did not try to lift her. He did not speak. He simply sat on the floor beside her, his presence a solid, unmoving weight in the darkness. He did not touch her, did not offer empty words of comfort that would have sounded like lies. He just stayed. He built up the fire, the flames slowly pushing back the shadows, and sat with his back against the wall, his knees drawn up, keeping his silent vigil. He stayed until her trembling finally ceased, until exhaustion dragged her into a heavy, dreamless sleep right there on the floor. Only then did he gently lift her, as if she were made of the most delicate glass, and place her back on the cot, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin. The weeks that followed were a slow, quiet rebuilding. The sight of her reflection had shattered her, but in the wreckage, something new began to grow. The quiet companionship of the man who had saved her became the foundation of her healing. They spoke more, not in long conversations, but in small exchanges that slowly, carefully, began to bridge the chasm of their individual solitudes. She found herself watching him. She noticed the way his hands, though calloused and strong, could be incredibly gentle when he was tending to her wounds or mending a piece of tack. She noticed the deep lines of sorrow around his eyes, lines that were not from age but from a pain that he carried deep inside him. And she noticed the scar, It was on his right shoulder, a patch of whitened, puckered skin partially visible at the collar of his shirt. It was a burn. One evening, as he was applying a fresh salve to her arm, his sleeve slipped, revealing the full extent of it. It was old, but unmistakable. "You have one, too," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He stilled, his hand hovering over her skin. He pulled his sleeve down, his movement stiff. He did not answer, his jaw tight. She did not press him, but a few days later, as they sat in comfortable silence while she ate her evening meal, she asked again, "How did you get your scar?" He stared into the fire for a long time, his face a mask of stone. She thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, thick with an old, unhealed grief. "Fire's not the worst pain," he said, his gaze still fixed on the flames. "Being alone is—" The words hung in the air between them, imbued with a weight of meaning that she could feel but not yet fully understand. It was an opening, a small crack in the formidable wall he had built around himself. Over the next few days, she began to ask more questions, gentle, simple inquiries, never pushing too hard, giving him the space to retreat into his silence whenever he needed. "Were you alone?" she asked one night. A long pause. "Not then," he said. "Was it your home that burned?" "A barn." The word was sharp, bitten off. Slowly, painfully, like pulling a deep, festering splinter from a wound. The story came out, piece by piece, in fragments offered up over several evenings. He had been young, not much older than she was now. He had been engaged to be married. Her name was Sarah. He spoke her name only once, a soft exhalation of breath that was almost a prayer. They were building a life together. On a small ranch in Texas, there was a lantern, knocked over by a skittish horse in the barn. It all happened so fast. The dry hay, the old wood. He had gotten out. He had tried to go back in for her. The other men had to hold him back, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. They told him it was too late. He had to stand there and watch it burn, knowing she was inside. He never forgave them for stopping him. Most of all, he never forgave himself for getting out when she had not. After that, he had just started riding. He had been riding ever since. As he spoke, Eleanor listened, her own pain receding in the face of his. She finally understood the weariness in his eyes, the profound sadness that clung to him like a shroud. He was not just a quiet man. He was a haunted one. He, too, had been shaped by fire. He, too, knew what it was to lose everything in a storm of smoke and flame. Their bond, which had been forged in the shared trauma of her rescue, was now tempered by a shared understanding of loss. It grew in the silence, in the shared glances across the small cabin, in the simple, profound intimacy of the touch of cloth against healing skin. He was no longer just her rescuer. He was a fellow survivor. One night, the grief that was always simmering just beneath her surface boiled over. The day had been hard. A simple task like brushing her hair had left her arm aching and her spirit weary. She sat on the edge of her cot, the bandages on her arm feeling tight and constricting, a constant reminder of her brokenness. Tears began to fall, hot and silent. "No one will want me like this," she whispered to the floor, the words a raw confession of her deepest fear. "No one will ever look at me again without seeing this." Colt, who had been cleaning his rifle by the fire, stopped what he was doing. He looked at her, his face serious in the firelight. He walked over and knelt in front of her, so that their eyes were level. "Then they don't deserve you," he said, his voice quiet but fierce. The words were simple, direct, and they struck her with the force of a physical blow. In a world that had judged her, condemned her, and dismissed her as ruined, this man, this stranger, saw her worth beyond her scars. A new kind of tear, one of gratitude, welled in her eyes. It was a pivotal moment, a shifting of the very ground beneath her. For the first time, when he reached out to unwrap the dressings on her arm for their nightly ritual, she did not look away. She did not close her eyes or stare at the wall. She watched him. He was meticulous, his movements careful and practiced, as he unwound the last layer of cloth, revealing the landscape of her new skin, the angry red ridges, the smooth, pale patches. She trembled. Shame, hot and profound, washed over her. It was hideous. A part of her wanted to scream, to cover herself, to hide from his gaze, but his eyes were not on her arm. His clear, gray eyes stayed on hers. He did not flinch. There was no pity in his expression, no disgust. There was only a quiet, steady acceptance. He picked up the jar of salve, rubbing some between his fingers to warm it. And then, his gaze still holding hers, he gently touched her burned skin. His touch was warm and sure. The salved leather of his fingertips slid over the tight, puckered flesh. 1,000 sensations shot through her, the sting of the medicine, the heat of his hand, the shock of another person touching this ruined part of her. She was braced for her own revulsion, for the instinct to pull away, to flinch from the contact. But she did not flinch. Instead, something deep inside her, a longing for connection that was stronger than her shame, took over, slowly, hesitantly. She leaned forward, a fraction of an inch, into his touch. Her breath caught in her throat. It was not a gesture of desire, but of surrender, of profound, aching trust. She was not just letting him tend her wound, she was letting him see her, all of her. He felt the shift, the small movement of her body toward his hand stilled on her arm. His gaze flickered down to her skin, then back up to her face. A flicker of something unreadable, surprise, uncertainty, perhaps even fear, passed through his eyes. Gently, deliberately, he pulled his hand away. He finished applying the salve in silence, his movements once again efficient and detached, and wrapped her arm in a clean dressing. But as he stood up and turned back toward the fire, the air in the cabin was irrevocably changed. A line had been crossed. He had offered her dignity, and she had responded with a trust so complete it was a terrifying and beautiful thing. The wall between them, the one built of his grief and her shame, had not been torn down. But a door had been opened, and neither of them knew what lay on the other side. The world opened up again on the back of a horse. Colt helped her mount his own steady mare, a gentle, older animal with a patient disposition. The first time he lifted her into the saddle, a cry of pain escaped her lips before she could stifle it. The scarred skin across her back and side, still tight and tender, pulled and screamed in protest. Her body was a stiff, unwilling passenger, every jolt of the horse's walk sending a fresh tremor of agony through her. But Colt walked beside her, his hand resting near her knee, his presence a silent promise of support. "Breathe through it," he said, his voice low. "Your body will remember." And slowly, it did. Each day they went a little farther, from a short walk around the cabin to a winding path through the pines that clung to the hillsides. The pain was always there, a constant companion, but it began to recede into the background, a dull ache instead of a sharp cry. She learned to move with the horse, to anticipate the rhythm of its gait. The sun on her face and the clean, sharp scent of pine in the air were a balm to her spirit. Her muscles, weak from weeks of inactivity, began to strengthen. A faint touch of color returned to her cheeks. She was still wrapped in cloth, her left arm still held close to her body, but she was no longer a prisoner of the cabin's four walls. Her spirit, so long dormant, was tentatively, cautiously, returning. It was this newfound strength that led her back to the ruins of her home. It was a pilgrimage she knew she had to make, a final farewell to the girl she had been. Colt did not question her when she asked him to take her there. He simply nodded and saddled the mare. The sight of the homestead was a physical blow. All that remained was a blackened, skeletal foundation, a jagged scar on the golden-brown skin of the hill. The chimney stood like a tombstone, a lonely sentinel guarding a graveyard of ash and charred timbers. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the scorched branches of a nearby oak. Grief, fresh and sharp, pierced her. This was where her parents had died. This was where her life had ended and begun anew in the same fiery instant. She slid from the horse, ignoring the protest of her body, and walked slowly into the square of ash that had once been her home. She could trace the layout in her mind, the main room, the kitchen, her own small bedroom. Soot and charcoal crunched under her boots. It was a place of ghosts, and she felt a desperate, irrational need to find something, anything, that had survived. A single tangible link to the life that had been stolen from her. She was drawn to the great stone hearth that had been the heart of the home. It was there her mother had cooked, where her father had cleaned his rifle, where she had sat on cold nights, reading the few books they owned, kneeling in the ash. She ran her good hand over the cool, soot-stained stones. One of them felt loose. She pulled at it, her fingers finding a purchase, and it shifted. Beneath it was a small, hollowed-out space, and nestled inside that space was a small, tin box, blackened by smoke but not destroyed by the flames. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was her mother's keepsake box. Her hands trembled as she worked at the simple clasp. It was warped by the heat, but it finally gave way with a groan. Inside, cushioned by a bit of yellowed calico, lay a few silver coins, a tarnished locket, and a folded piece of paper, with reverent fingers. She unfolded the letter. The handwriting was her mother's, a familiar, spidery script. "My dearest Eleanor," it began. "If you are reading this, then I have found the courage. Tonight, when he is asleep, we will go. I cannot let him do this to you. I cannot let him sell you like livestock to that man. This is no life for you, my wildflower. You were meant for more than this cage of his making. I have saved a little, enough to get us to my cousins in Monterey. We can be safe there. Be ready, be quiet. We will find a better life. I swear it. Your loving mother." The letter fell from her trembling fingers into her lap. The words swam before her eyes, blurring through a sudden rush of tears. Her mother, her silent, long-suffering mother, had not been resigned at all. She had been planning to run, to save them both. The fire had not just taken her parents. It had taken her escape, her future, a life she had not even known was possible. And then, a new thought, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, pierced through her grief. The timing. The fire had happened on the very night they were supposed to leave, the night before the wedding that would have trapped her forever. Her father had been a stern, hard man, but would he have stood by and let his wife take his daughter, his property, away from him? And Silas Croft, a man who viewed her as a transaction, an addition to his ranch. How would he have reacted to the news that his bride had fled? Her mother's death was not an accident. The fire was not an accident. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening certainty. It was a trap, a punishment, a brutal, final way of ensuring that Eleanor could not escape her fate, that her mother's rebellion would be silenced forever. The fire was meant to destroy the evidence of their planned escape and, perhaps, to scare Eleanor into submission. Or maybe it was never meant to be survived at all. She was just a loose end in a cruel bargain between two ruthless men. The air in her lungs turned to poison. The silent hills around her no longer seemed empty, but watchful. The whole world felt like a conspiracy. She looked down at the letter, at her mother's desperate, hopeful words, and a new emotion began to smolder in the ashes of her grief. Rage. She shared her suspicions with Colt that evening, her voice low and tight with a fury she had never known she possessed. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, half expecting him to dismiss her fears as the ramblings of a traumatized girl. But he listened, his gray eyes fixed on hers, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he took the letter she offered him and read it, his lips a thin, hard line. He handed it back to her. "Your father was in debt to Croft?" he asked, his voice flat. Eleanor shook her head. "I do not know. He never spoke of such things, but we were not prosperous. And Mr. Croft, he is a wealthy man." Colt nodded slowly, staring into the fire as if seeing the events play out in the flames. "Men like that," he said, his voice a low growl, "do not like losing what they think they own." He was not questioning her. He was confirming her worst fears. "What do you want to do?" "I want to go to town," she said, the words coming out stronger than she expected. "I want to speak to the sheriff. I want to show him this letter. This is evidence. They cannot ignore this." He looked at her for a long moment, at the fierce, determined light that had replaced the fear in her eyes. "They can," he said simply, "and they probably will. But I will take you." The journey to redemption was a descent into a different kind of hell. As they rode down the dusty main street, a palpable silence fell over the town. Men on the boardwalk stopped talking. Women paused in their shopping, turning to stare. It was as if a foul wind had blown in from the hills, carrying with it the specter of death and scandal. Eleanor wore a simple, dark dress Colt had purchased for her, and she had fashioned a veil from a piece of black netting to cover her face. She wore gloves to hide her hands. She had thought this would grant her some measure of anonymity, but she was wrong. The coverings only made her more of a spectacle, a mysterious, damaged creature to be gawked at. The whispers followed them like a cloud of flies, icy stares from the town's respectable women, who saw her as a fallen, ruined thing. Leering, curious glances from the men who congregated outside the saloon, their eyes trying to imagine the horrors that lay beneath her veil. And worst of all, the children, who pointed with a frank, cruel innocence, their voices carrying on the still air. "Look, Ma, it's the burned girl!" Her spirit, so recently revived, shriveled under the weight of their judgment. She kept her head held high, her back as straight as the stiff scar tissue would allow. But inside, she was trembling. Colt rode beside her, a stone-faced protector, his presence a shield that did little to deflect the venomous glances but gave her the strength to endure them. The sheriff's office was a small, dusty room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and old paper. Sheriff Brody was a portly man with a droopy mustache and tired, indifferent eyes. He listened to Eleanor's story with a patient, condescending air, his gaze occasionally flicking to Colt, who stood silently by the door. When she presented the letter, he took it, glanced at it without much interest, and handed it back. "Miss Vance," he said, his tone that of a man explaining a simple truth to a child, "this is a very sad story. You have been through a terrible ordeal, but this letter, it proves nothing. It is just the words of a distraught woman. It is not evidence of a crime." "But the timing," Eleanor began, her voice shaking with frustration. "The night of the fire." "Fires happen," the sheriff interrupted, his voice hardening slightly. "Especially in this dry country. You should be grateful you are alive. Mr. Croft has already spoken to me. He is a respected man in this community. He believes you were unwell, that you may have started the fire yourself in a state of distress." The injustice of it stole her breath. "That is a lie." "Perhaps," the sheriff said with a sigh, standing up to signal the end of the meeting. "But it is his word against that of a girl who has suffered a great shock. My advice to you is to go back up to those hills and heal. There is nothing for you here." Defeated and humiliated, they walked back out into the harsh sunlight of the main street. The whispers seemed louder now, tinged with a smug, "I told you so" satisfaction. As they reached their horses, a voice, oily and self-satisfied, cut through the air. "Well, well, look what crawled out of the ashes." Eleanor froze. It was Silas Croft. He stood on the boardwalk, flanked by two of his ranch hands. a cruel smirk on his face. He was exactly as she remembered, stout, gray, and radiating an aura of brutish ownership. His eyes raked over her veiled form with contempt. "I heard you were telling stories to the sheriff," he sneered. "You should have been grateful for the match I offered. Now look at you. Ruined." He took a step forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial leer. "No man will touch you now. Who would want a bride who comes in pieces?" Something inside Eleanor snapped, but before she could speak, Colt moved. He stepped between her and Croft, his body a solid wall of fury. "That's enough," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Croft laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Or what? Drifter? You going to protect this thing?" He never finished the sentence. Colt's fist shot out, a blur of motion that connected with Croft's jaw with a sickening crack. Croft staggered backward, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, and fell into the dust of the street. His ranch hands, after a moment's hesitation, lunged at Colt. The street erupted into chaos. Fists flew, men shouted, women screamed. Colt fought with a cold, brutal efficiency, but he was outnumbered. Within a minute, Sheriff Brody and his deputy were there, hauling Colt off the other men. Croft was helped to his feet, dabbing at a trickle of blood on his lip, his face purple with rage. "Arrest him!" Croft bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at Colt. "He assaulted me! In public!" Sheriff Brody did not hesitate. He shoved Colt toward the jailhouse, the deputy grabbing his other arm. Eleanor ran forward, her heart pounding with terror. "No, it was not his fault. Mister, Croft provoked him. He insulted me." The sheriff barely glanced at her. "He threw the first punch. Miss—" "That is all that matters." She pleaded, she argued, but it was useless. The townsfolk had gathered, a grim, silent jury. They saw what they wanted to see, a respectable citizen assaulted by a violent drifter. The law was on the side of Silas Croft. They locked Colt in a cell. Eleanor stood outside the bars, her hands gripping the cold iron. "What will happen?" she asked, her voice a desperate whisper. "Croft is pressing charges," Sheriff Brody said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Assault, disturbing the peace. He will stay here until the circuit judge comes through next month. Unless, of course, Mr. Croft decides to be merciful." She knew what that meant. She went to find Silas Croft. He was in the saloon, being tended to by his men, holding a stake to his swelling jaw. He looked at her with triumphant, hateful eyes. "Mercy?" he said, his voice thick. "The drifter will make a public apology, on his knees, and you will pay a fine for my troubles. $50. $50. It might as well have been a king's ransom. She had nothing. Colt had next to nothing. It was an impossible sum. She returned to the jailhouse, her body numb with shock and despair. She told Colt the terms. He looked at her through the bars, his face bruised but his eyes clear. "Do not pay him," he said. "Do not even think about it." "But you will be in here for a month." "There are worse places to be," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Go back to the cabin. Be safe. I will be fine." There was nothing more to be said. She left the jailhouse and walked through the hostile town, every stare a physical blow. She mounted the mare and began the long, lonely ride back into the hills. The setting sun cast long shadows that looked like grasping fingers. She was shaken. She was ashamed. She felt the familiar sting of tears behind her eyes, the helpless sobs of a victim. But as she rode, something shifted. The image of Croft's sneering face, the sheriff's dismissive wave, the cold, judgmental eyes of the townsfolk, it all coalesced inside her. The humiliation burned away the sorrow. The injustice cauterized the wound of her shame. The tears would not fall. Her jaw tightened, the same way she had seen Colt's do. Her good hand, holding the reins, clenched into a fist. A cold, hard thing took root in her chest, a feeling she had never experienced before in her life. It was not the passive sadness of grief. It was the active, razor-sharp edge of fury. For the first time, Eleanor Vance did not cry. She seethed. The silence Colt left behind was a hollow vessel. In the first days of his absence, Eleanor filled it with his memory, with the echo of his quiet presence. But memory was a ghost, and it could not chop wood or fetch water. The rage that had carried her out of redemption cooled into a hard, dense resolve. It was a fuel, she discovered, far more potent than sorrow. She had been a passenger in her own life, first in her father's house, then in Colt's care. Now, she was alone. The choice was simple. She could wither, or she could work. She chose work. The fury in her soul demanded an outlet, and she gave it one. She took up Colt's axe. The first time, the heavy tool was clumsy in her grip, and the shock of the impact against a log sent a bolt of fire through the scarred tissue of her back and arm. She cried out, dropping the axe, her body trembling with pain and frustration. The girl she had been would have retreated to the cot, defeated. But the woman who had faced down Silas Croft picked it up again. She swung and swung again, her grunts of effort mingling with the sharp crack of splitting wood. The pain became a rhythm, a reminder of what she was fighting for. The growing stack of firewood was a monument to her endurance. Her days took on a new shape, one defined not by healing but by doing. She tended the small garden Colt had started, her good hand pulling weeds, her mind focused on the simple, honest work of coaxing life from the soil. She found his tools and, through trial and error, learned to mend a broken strap on the saddle, to sharpen a dull blade on the whetstone. Each small success was a victory, a quiet declaration of her own competence. She was more than just a collection of wounds. She was a survivor. The greatest challenge was the rifle. Colt had left it propped in the corner, a long, heavy piece of steel and wood. She knew, with a primal certainty, that she needed to learn how to use it. The world was not a safe place, and she could no longer depend on anyone else for protection. It took all her strength to lift it, to settle the stock against her uninjured shoulder. The first time she pulled the trigger, the recoil slammed into her, knocking her backward. Her ears rang, and her shoulder ached, but she did not drop it. She loaded it again, her movements clumsy but determined, and fired at a distant pine cone until she could hit it 3 times out of 5. The smell of gunpowder was sharp and clean, the smell of power. Weeks passed. The hard physical labor hardened her body and her spirit. The soft, girlish roundness of her face gave way to leaner, sharper angles. Her eyes, once full of a timid uncertainty, now held a direct, unwavering gaze. She was learning to survive, not just in the absence of Colt, but in the absence of the life she had once known. One morning, she woke with a new resolve. She was tired of hiding. She was tired of being the monster in the whispers of the town. She washed her face, braided her hair, and put on the simple dark dress she had worn before. She looked at the black veil lying on the cot, the flimsy shield she had used to hide her shame. With a deliberate, steady hand, she picked it up, folded it, and placed it in the cold hearth. She would not wear it again. She rode into redemption alone. This time, she did not keep her eyes downcast. She did not flinch from the stairs. She had removed the bandages from her left arm, leaving the scarred skin exposed to the air. The sun was hot on the puckered flesh, a strange, sensitive feeling. As she rode down the main street, the familiar silence fell. But this time, it was different. It was a silence of shock, of disbelief. The women who had whispered behind her back now fell silent, their eyes wide. The men who had leered now looked away, unsettled by her direct gaze. She had taken their power from them by refusing to hide her scars. She dared them to look, to judge her to her face. She was not a monster to be feared. She was a woman who had walked through fire and survived. Her anger had burned away her shame, and in its place, a fierce, defiant pride had begun to bloom. She did not go to the sheriff's office. She went to the small house of Mrs. Gable, the seamstress, a woman who had sometimes shared a quiet cup of tea with her mother. Mrs. Gable opened the door, her face a mask of pity and fear.
"Eleanor,"
she stammered.
"Child, what are you doing here? It is not safe. I need your help."
"Martha," Eleanor said, her voice even and calm, "I need to know who my mother's friends were, the ones she trusted." The fear in the older woman's eyes warred with a flicker of old affection. She looked up and down the street, as if expecting Silas Croft to appear at any moment, and then quickly pulled Eleanor inside. In the dim, cluttered parlor, over a cup of weak tea, the story began to unfold. Eleanor spoke to Mrs. Gable, and then to the baker's wife, and then to old Mrs. Pembroke, who lived at the edge of town. She did not speak of the fire or of murder. She spoke of her mother's sadness, of her loneliness, and the women, seeing her strength, her unconcealed scars, began to open up. They gave her small pieces of the puzzle, a whispered comment about Jebediah's gambling debts, a mention of Croft visiting the homestead far more often than was proper, a memory of her mother, Martha, weeping in the churchyard. It was Mrs. Pembroke who gave her the journals.
"Your mother left these with me,"
she said, her voice thin and reedy.
"She said if anything ever happened to her,
I was to give them to you."
She was so afraid.
They were not diaries, but simple ledgers, filled with notes on household expenses. But tucked between the pages were pressed wildflowers and cryptic, heartbreaking notes. "Silas's shadow falls longer each day." And another, "Jebediah has sold the last of my mother's silver. He says the debt must be paid." And finally, the clue that made Eleanor's blood run cold. "He will not listen. He says the deed to the north pasture is lost, but I know Silas has it. I saw him take it from the strongbox. The land deed, her family's land. The only thing of value they had possessed, it had been stolen. The marriage was not just a transaction. It was the final payment on a debt secured by blackmail and theft." She rode back to the hills with the journals in her saddlebag, her mind racing. She had the motive. She had the proof of a conspiracy, but she was one woman against a town run by a powerful, ruthless man. When she arrived back at the cabin, a curl of smoke was rising from the chimney. Her heart leaped into her throat. She slid from the horse, the rifle in her hand, and crept toward the door. It swung open before she reached it. Colt stood there. He was thinner, and a fresh bruise colored his cheekbone, but he was free. He looked at her, and then at the rifle she held, and a slow, weary smile touched his lips. His eyes, however, were not smiling. They were taking her in, noticing everything, the new hardness in her jaw, the confidence in her posture, and the bare, scarred skin of her arm, offered up to the world without apology. He had left a frightened girl, and he had come back to a woman forged in iron and fire. She lowered the rifle. He looked so tired, so grateful to be home. The old Eleanor would have run into his arms, seeking comfort and safety. But she was not the old Eleanor. She stood her ground, a small smile touching her own lips. "I can stand now," she said. It was a simple statement of fact, but it was also a redefinition of everything between them. "I am not the broken thing you rescued. I am your equal." He understood. He simply nodded, his eyes filled with a new kind of respect. "I see that," he said. Later, she told him everything. The journals, the land deed, the whispers of the townswomen. He listened in his usual intense silence. He did not offer advice or tell her what to do. He waited for her to lead. The final piece of the puzzle came from the most unexpected of sources. Preacher Miller, a man who had always been a friend to her family, sent a boy with a message, asking her to come to the church. She went with Colt, a sense of foreboding settling in her stomach. They met in his small, book-lined study. The preacher was pale, his hands trembling. He confessed in a torrent of guilt-ridden words. Croft had come to him weeks before the fire. He knew of Jebediah's gambling debts. He had threatened to expose him, to ruin him completely. Eleanor was the price of his silence. "Your father was a proud man," the preacher whispered, his eyes filled with shame. "He was trapped. He saw no other way. I told him it was a sin, but he would not listen, and I did nothing. I stood by and let it happen. May God forgive me." Eleanor listened, her rage a cold, still thing in her chest. It was all true, every last sordid detail. Armed with the preacher's confession and her mother's journals, she went back to town. She walked into the sheriff's office, Colt a silent, imposing shadow behind her, and filed a petition for the inheritance of her family's land. She presented her evidence. Sheriff Brody looked uncomfortable, his indifferent facade cracking under the weight of her cold, factual presentation. He deferred. Of course, a matter like this would have to be brought before the town council. The council met in the back room of the general store. 3 men, all of them friends of Silas Croft, their faces closed and hostile. She stood before them and made her case, her voice clear and strong, without a single tremor. She spoke of the deed, of the blackmail, of her mother's letter. They listened, and then they dismissed her. "There is no proof of theft," one of them said. "Without the deed itself, it is just your word." "It is a family matter," said another. "Not for the council to decide." They were going to bury it. They were going to protect their own. Desperation clawed at her, but she held it back. She looked at their smug, dismissive faces, and she did not back down. Then Colt, who had been silent throughout the entire exchange, took a step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a threat. He simply spoke, his voice a low, chilling promise. "If you do not," he said, his gray eyes locking onto each of the men in turn, "I will tear the truth out myself." The atmosphere in the room changed. They knew it was not an idle boast. They looked at Colt, at his bruised knuckles and his unwavering gaze, and they saw a man who had nothing to lose and a long history with violence. They began to stammer, to promise a review, an investigation. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. They left town together that night as dusk settled over the hills, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. They rode in silence for a long time, the tension of the day slowly seeping out of them. They made camp in a small clearing, the scent of pine and damp earth heavy in the air. And then it happened. The strength that had held Eleanor together for weeks finally broke. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, ragged sound. It was followed by another, and another, until she was shaking, weeping with an intensity that terrified her. But as she cried, a strange sound bubbled up with the sobs. A laugh. It was a wild, hysterical sound, full of pain and relief, and a kind of terrible, beautiful joy. She slid from her horse and sank to the ground, sobbing and laughing at the same time, her hands pressed to her face. Colt was beside her instantly, his hands on her shoulders. "Eleanor!" "I am still here," she gasped between sobs, looking up at him, her face wet with tears. "After all of it, the fire, the pain, they tried to erase me, but I am still breathing." He held her then, simply held her as the storm of emotion passed through her, his arms a circle of safety in the vast wilderness. When her tears finally subsided, a profound quiet settled between them, deeper and more intimate than any they had known before. The stars emerged, cold and brilliant in the black sky. She looked at him, at his weary, gentle face in the soft starlight. The pain of her scars was a dull throb, a constant reminder of what had been done to her body. But tonight, she did not want to be defined by that pain. She wanted to be reminded of the woman she was beneath the scars, the woman who was still alive, who could still feel. "Colt," she whispered, her voice husky with tears. She reached up and touched his face, her good hand tracing the line of his jaw. "Help me forget the pain. Remind me of who I am." He understood what she was asking. He did not move, did not speak, leaving the choice, the power, entirely in her hands. Slowly, achingly, with hands that trembled, she began to unbutton her dress. The small pearl buttons were a challenge for her clumsy fingers. He did not rush her. He did not help her. He simply watched, his eyes dark with an emotion she could not name. The cool night air touched her skin as the fabric parted. She shrugged the dress from her shoulders, letting it fall to her waist. In the faint light of the rising moon, her scars were a roadmap of her survival, a tapestry of silver and rose. She shivered, not from cold, but from a lifetime of shame. But when she looked at his face, she saw no pity, no revulsion. She saw only a profound, heartbreaking reverence. He leaned forward and touched his lips to the puckered skin on her shoulder. It was not a kiss of passion, but of benediction. A tear slid from his eye and fell onto her skin, warm and salty. He moved lower, his lips tracing the edge of a long scar along her arm, kissing each mark, each imperfection, each testament to her pain. He was not ignoring her wounds. He was honoring them. She did not flinch. She leaned into his touch, a soft sigh escaping her lips. Her shame was burning away, not in the heat of a destructive fire, but in the warmth of his acceptance. Their union, when it finally happened, was not an act of lust, but of profound healing. It was raw, and in moments, painful, a beautiful, aching collision of two broken souls finding wholeness in each other. The fire had taken her body, had twisted it and scarred it, but in the ashes, it had given her back her soul. And tonight, under the silent, watchful eyes of the stars, she was finally claiming it as her own. They did not go back to Colt's cabin in the high hills. That was a place of healing, a sanctuary for a wounded girl. The woman Eleanor had become needed something else. She needed roots. They rode back to the blackened patch of earth that was her inheritance and began the slow, arduous work of reclamation. It was a defiant act, a planting of a flag in scorched earth. They lived in a canvas tent while they worked, two solitary figures against the vast, indifferent landscape. The work was brutal, relentless. They salvaged what they could from the ruins, prying half-burnt timbers from the ash, their hands and faces perpetually smudged with soot. They gathered the scorched stones from the fallen chimney, scrubbing them clean in the nearby creek. Slowly, painstakingly, a new structure began to rise from the footprint of the old one. It was not a house, not yet. It was a rough shelter, half stone and half timber, with a sod roof and a floor of packed earth. It was crude and imperfect, but it was theirs, built not just with their hands, but with their shared will. It was not a memory of what was lost, but a promise of what could be built. Their presence did not go unnoticed. The homestead, though isolated, was visible from the main track that led to redemption. A week into their labor, 3 riders appeared on the horizon, their forms wavering in the heat. Eleanor's hand went instinctively to the rifle that was never far from her side. Colt simply straightened up from his work, his face a mask of wary calm. The riders were townsfolk, men whose faces she recognized from the general store and the saloon. One of them, a blacksmith's assistant named Hatcher, was a known crony of Silas Croft. They reined in their horses a few yards from the half-built shelter, their expressions a mixture of contempt and unease. "You have got no business here," Hatcher called out, his voice a belligerent drawl. "This land belongs to Silas Croft now. He had an arrangement with the girl's father." Eleanor stepped forward, the rifle held loosely but purposefully in her hands. The men's eyes were drawn to her, to the unadorned scars on her arm, and they shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. "My father is dead," Eleanor said, her voice clear and carrying on the still air. "Any arrangement he made died with him. This is Vance's land. I am a Vance. Now get off my property." "You are a curse on this place," another man spat. "A troublemaker. You should have had the decency to disappear." The words, which once would have shattered her, now glanced off the armor of her resolve. She took another step forward, her eyes locking onto Hatcher's. "The girl you knew disappeared in a fire," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense pitch. "The one you left to die. I am what came back." There was something in her eyes, a cold, hard fire, that unnerved them. They had come expecting a broken victim or a mad woman. They found a queen standing on her own scorched soil, and they had no answer for her. After a moment of blustering indecision, Hatcher jerked his reins, and the three of them turned and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent anger in their wake. Eleanor did not lower the rifle until they were a speck on the horizon. Their victory was short-lived. A few days later, as dusk was bleeding across the sky, another group of riders appeared. This time there were 5 of them, and this time Silas Croft was at their head. The other 4 were not townsfolk. They had the hard, merciless look of hired guns. Colt moved to stand in front of Eleanor, pushing her toward the shelter. "Get inside," he commanded. "I will not," she said, raising her own rifle. They stood side by side as Croft and his men dismounted, their spurs jingling with menace. "This is your last chance," Croft said, his voice tight with fury. He had not forgiven the public humiliation of Colt's punch, nor the defiance of the woman he considered his property. "Leave this land, or be carried off it." "This land is mine, Silas," Eleanor said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "And you are trespassing." Croft laughed, a humorless, ugly sound. "Your word means nothing. This deed belongs to me." He gestured to his men. "Take them." The world exploded in a chaos of sound and motion. Colt fired first. His shot aimed not to kill, but to warn, kicking up dirt at the feet of the advancing men. They answered with a volley of gunfire. Eleanor felt Colt shove her hard, sending her stumbling backward as a bullet whizzed past where her head had been. He grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, and staggered. A dark stain was spreading across his thigh. He was hit. The sight of it, the sight of his blood soaking his trousers, sent a bolt of pure, cold rage through her. The fear was gone, burned away. These men had tried to take everything from her, and now they had hurt the one person who had stood by her side. She raised her rifle, the stock pressed firmly against her good shoulder. She did not aim for a chest or a head. She aimed for the leg of the man closest to Colt, the one raising his pistol for another shot. She steadied her breath, squeezed the trigger, and fired. The man screamed, a high, thin sound, and collapsed, clutching his shattered kneecap. The sudden, calculated violence of her action stunned the other men into a moment's hesitation. It was the opening they needed. Colt, leaning against the stone wall of the shelter, fired again, and another of the hired guns went down, clutching his arm. Outnumbered and facing 2 people who were clearly willing to fight to the death, Croft's resolve crumbled. He and his remaining men scrambled for their horses and fled into the gathering darkness, leaving their 2 wounded comrades behind. The man Colt had shot was groaning, but conscious. The one Eleanor had shot was writhing on the ground, his face pale with shock and pain. She looked at him, at his agony, and felt no pity. She felt only a cold, hard sense of justice. She tended to Colt's wound first, her hands surprisingly steady as she tore a strip from her petticoat to make a bandage. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his thigh. It was painful, but not mortal. He watched her, his face tight with pain, but his eyes were filled with a kind of awe. Then, she turned her attention to the man she had shot. She tied his hands and, using a length of rope, fashioned a crude drag line. She helped Colt into the shelter, gave him a canteen of water and the rifle, and then she went to her own horse. She mounted, tied the rope to her saddle horn, and began the long, slow ride to redemption, dragging the groaning, wounded man behind her. She arrived just after dawn. The town was just beginning to stir. Her arrival was a spectacle of grim determination. She rode straight to the sheriff's office. The sight of her dragging a wounded man creating a ripple of shocked silence that followed her down the main street. Sheriff Brody came out onto the boardwalk, his face a mixture of disbelief and alarm. Eleanor reined in her horse. She looked down at the lawman, her face hard and unforgiving in the morning light. "This man," she said, her voice as cold as a grave, "along with Silas Croft and several others, attacked us on my land last night. He was trespassing. He was attempting to kill us." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You want the law, Sheriff? Here it is." The sheriff was speechless. This was not a frightened girl with a sad story. This was a woman who had brought him a bleeding piece of evidence and dropped it at his feet. He could not ignore this. He could not dismiss it. She had forced his hand in the most public and undeniable way possible. The effect on the town was seismic. The story of Eleanor Vance shooting an armed man to defend her home and then dragging him to the law became an instant legend. The narrative that Silas Croft had so carefully constructed began to crumble. Public pressure, a force the sheriff could not ignore, began to mount. And then, a strange and unexpected thing happened. Other women began to speak. The baker's wife came forward with a story of Croft trying to cheat her husband out of a delivery payment. Mrs. Gable spoke of his inappropriate advances toward her young daughter, quietly at first, and then with growing confidence. The women of redemption began to share their own stories of mistreatment and intimidation at the hands of powerful men. Eleanor's single act of defiance had given them a voice. She knew she needed the deed itself. Armed with the preacher's confession and her mother's journals, she started her own investigation. The preacher, in his guilt, remembered seeing Croft leaving the office of a lawyer in the next county, a man known for his discreet and often shady dealings. Eleanor rode there, a 2-day journey. She told the lawyer's clerk a story about settling her late father's estate, mentioning Croft's name as a business partner. The clerk, eager to be helpful, searched the records, and there it was, a transfer of title for the north pasture of the Vance homestead, signed by her father, dated 2 weeks before the fire, but the signature was a clumsy, unconvincing forgery. It was the proof she needed. With the forged deed in her possession, she filed a formal suit against Silas Croft for theft, fraud, and attempted murder. A court date was set. It would not be a grand trial in a marble courthouse, but a simple hearing in front of the circuit judge, held in the town's small, stuffy meeting hall. But it was real. The day of the hearing, the hall was packed. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath. Silas Croft was there, his face pale and sweating, his usual arrogance replaced by a hunted look. Colt sat in the front row, his leg bandaged, a crutch leaning against his chair. When it was her turn to speak, Eleanor walked to the front of the room. She wore the same simple dark dress, but she wore it like armor. Her scars were uncovered, a visible testament to her story. She looked at the judge, at the faces of the townsfolk, and she began to speak. Her voice was not loud, but it filled the room with its quiet power. She spoke of the fire, of the pain of her burns, of the deeper pain of losing her family and her home. She spoke of her scars, not as marks of shame, but as a reminder that she had survived. She spoke of being seen as broken, as ruined, as a thing to be pitied or scorned. And then she spoke of love. Not a romantic, gentle love, but the fierce, protective love she had found with a man who had looked at her wounds and had seen not a monster, but a survivor. She spoke of being helpless, and of the moment she had decided she would be helpless no more. "They tried to burn me from the earth," she concluded, her eyes finding Croft's in the crowd. "They tried to bury my name in whispers and lies. They thought that because my skin was scarred, my spirit was broken. They were wrong. My spirit was forged in that fire, and I stand here today, not as a victim asking for your pity, but as a woman demanding justice. As she spoke, Colt watched her, his heart aching with a feeling he could not name. It was love, but it was more than that. It was a profound, staggering awe. The timid, trembling girl he had pulled from the fire, the woman who had collapsed in sobs at the sight of her own reflection, the one who had cried in his arms in the woods, was gone. In her place stood a warrior. The woman who had once whispered in terror now spoke with the voice of thunder. The verdict was swift. The forged deed, the preacher's testimony, and the sheer, undeniable force of Eleanor's own presence were insurmountable. Silas Croft was found guilty of fraud and theft. The charge of attempted murder was harder to prove, but his reputation was destroyed. He was shamed, ruined, ordered to pay a significant restitution. He left Redemption that very evening, a disgraced man, and was never seen again. That night, in their small, sturdy cabin, a fire crackled in the hearth, a tame and welcome flame. The legal battle was over. The land was truly hers. She lay beside Colt on their simple bed, the moonlight streaming through the window. She traced the lines of his face, the face of the man who had been her anchor, her shield, her partner. He had stood by her, had fought for her, had gone to jail for her. But she knew, with a clarity that was as pure and bright as the moonlight, the deepest truth of her journey. She leaned over and kissed him, a slow, deep kiss of profound gratitude and equal love. "You did not save me," she whispered against his lips, the words a final, quiet declaration of her own hard-won soul. "You just gave me the chance to save myself." The seasons turned, painting the California hills in a slow, cyclical rhythm of gold and green. The raw, skeletal shelter on the Vance homestead fleshed out, becoming a home. Months passed, measured not in calendar pages but in the progress of their life together. The rough-hewn timbers settled, and the stone hearth, built from the scorched bones of the old one, now radiated a steady, comforting warmth. Eleanor and Colt worked the land not just for survival, but for a future. They cleared a larger plot for a garden, and soon, rows of beans and squash pushed through the dark, fertile earth. A small flock of chickens scratched in the dirt near a coop Colt had built, their cheerful clucking a new and welcome sound in the quiet hills. Eleanor, too, had been transformed by the turning of the seasons. The land was in her blood now, the grit under her fingernails a badge of honor. But her influence was beginning to spread beyond the boundaries of her property. Her stand against Silas Croft had planted a seed in the town of Redemption, and other women, tentatively at first, began to seek her out. They did not come for pity or gossip. They came for strength. It started with Abigail, the blacksmith's young wife, whose husband had a heavy hand when he drank. She came to Eleanor with a bruised cheek and fearful eyes. Eleanor listened, not with platitudes, but with a fierce, focused anger. The next day, she began to teach Abigail how to use a rifle. Soon, 2 other women joined them, meeting in a hidden clearing in the woods. Eleanor taught them how to stand, how to aim, how to load and fire, how to turn a tool of violence into an instrument of self-preservation. She was not just teaching them to shoot. She was teaching them that they had a right to be safe, a right to say no. Her fight also took on a quieter, more deliberate form. In the long evenings, by the light of a kerosene lamp, she began to write letters. She wrote to the circuit judge, to the state assemblyman, to anyone she thought might listen. She used her own story as a foundation, but she wrote about the larger injustices she saw, about women with no legal claim to their own property, about laws that left them trapped in abusive marriages with no recourse. Her prose was simple, direct, and unadorned, but it carried the undeniable weight of truth, of a lived and painful experience. She was taking her private war and making it a public cause. One afternoon, a wagon crested the hill, moving slowly toward the homestead. It was the Gable family, who had a small farm a half-day's ride to the north. Mr. Gable sat holding the reins, while his wife sat beside him, clutching the hand of a small, silent girl of about 10. The child was wrapped in a thick shawl, despite the warmth of the day. Eleanor and Colt came out to meet them. Mrs. Gable's eyes were red-rimmed with weeping.
"Eleanor,"
she said, her voice trembling.
we heard you knew about Burns."
She gently pulled the shawl away from her daughter. Lucy. The left side of the little girl's face and her neck were a mess of raw, puckered scars from a kitchen accident with a pot of boiling water. The girl stared at the ground, her small body rigid with shame, her unscarred cheek wet with silent tears. Eleanor's heart ached with a profound, painful recognition. She saw herself in that small, trembling form, in that downcast gaze. She did not speak to the parents. She walked over to the little girl and knelt in the dirt, so they were at eye level. She did not reach out to touch her. She simply waited until Lucy dared to lift her eyes. When the girl finally looked at her, Eleanor gave her a small, sad smile. She gently pushed back the sleeve of her own dress, revealing the intricate, silvery map of her own scars. Lucy's eyes widened, first in fear, and then in a dawning, wondrous understanding. She was not alone. She was not the only one. "You will live," Eleanor said, her voice soft but firm, the words a sacred promise. "It hurts, I know it hurts, but you will live." She did not offer a cure or false comfort. She offered the simple, brutal, and ultimately hopeful truth of her own existence. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of something other than pain appeared in the little girl's eyes. As Eleanor grew into her own strength, she began to notice a shadow returning to Colt. The quiet peace he had found with her was being troubled by a familiar ghost. She would find him staring into the fire, his face etched with the old, deep sorrow she had seen when he first told her of Sarah. He had fought for Eleanor's justice, had reveled in her strength, but seeing her so whole, so alive, seemed to cast his own past failure into sharper relief. He had saved one woman from the fire, but he felt he had no right to the happiness it had brought him, for he had failed to save the other. His guilt was a silent, insidious poison. One evening, he sat on the porch, polishing a piece of tack, his movements mechanical, his mind 1,000 miles away. Eleanor came and sat beside him, leaning her head against his good shoulder. For a long time, they said nothing, simply watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. "You are thinking of her," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. He did not deny it. He let out a long, slow breath. "I should have gone back in," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper of self-recrimination. "They held me back, but I should have fought them. I should have." "You would have died," she said softly. "It would have been better than living with it," he said, the pain in his voice as raw as if it had happened yesterday. She sat up, turning to face him. She gently took his hand and brought it to her own scarred arm. "Do you feel this?" she asked. "This is real. We are real." She then leaned forward and gently, reverently, kissed the old, white burn scar on his shoulder, the mark of her own rescue. He flinched, as if the touch pained him. "We have both bled," she whispered against his skin, her breath warm. "We have both lost. That does not mean we are cursed. It means we have earned this. We have earned this peace. You and I." He looked at her, at the fierce, loving light in her eyes, and something in his own gaze seemed to break. The guilt was still there, a scar on his soul as permanent as the one on his shoulder. But her words were a soothing salve. She was not just accepting his past, she was making it a part of their shared story, a story not just of loss, but of survival and redemption. He pulled her to him, burying his face in her hair, and held on as if she were the only thing keeping him from drifting away. The following spring, Redemption held its annual town gathering. It was a celebration of the end of the rainy season, A day of food, music, and community. A year ago, Eleanor would have sooner walked into a den of wolves than face the people of the town. Now, she felt a quiet desire to go, to stand among them not as an outcast, but as a part of the place she was helping to change. She made herself a new dress for the occasion. It was not white, the color of a bride she would never be, nor the somber black of a mourner. It was a deep, forest green, the color of new leaves and resilient life. The neckline was modest, but the sleeves were short, leaving her scarred arm bare for all to see. It was a statement, a final, silent declaration that she had nothing to hide. When they rode into town, the reaction was not what she had expected. There were no whispers. There were no stares of pity or morbid curiosity. Heads turned. Yes, but the faces held a new expression. Respect. The women she had taught to shoot nodded to her, their faces proud. Old misses. Pembroke waved from her porch. Even Sheriff Brody, standing on the steps of his office, tipped his hat to her. She had not just won a court case. She had won the soul of the town. They spent the day in a comfortable, easy peace. They shared a meal on a long picnic blanket, listened to a fiddler play a lively tune, and spoke with the Gable family, whose daughter Lucy now played with the other children, a bonnet covering her healing skin, but a real smile on her lips. Eleanor moved through the crowd with a quiet confidence, a woman at peace with herself and her place in the world. She was no longer defined by the fire, but by the life she had built from its embers. That night, back at their homestead, the moon was a perfect silver coin in a sky littered with diamond dust. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. They stood outside their cabin, the home they had built together, their hands intertwined. Eleanor looked up at Colt, at his strong, gentle face bathed in the soft moonlight. A year ago, she had asked him to help her forget her pain. Tonight, she wanted something different. She wanted to celebrate her life. All of it, the pain and the joy, the scars and the strength. Slowly, deliberately, she let go of his hand and began to unbutton her dress. This time, her hands were not trembling with shame or fear. They were steady with purpose, with a deep and certain desire. It was a choice, made in the fullness of her own power. The green fabric slid from her shoulders, pooling at her feet in a soft whisper of cotton, leaving her standing before him in the moonlight, her body a testament to everything she had endured and everything she had become. He looked at her, at the beautiful, imperfect landscape of her skin, and his eyes filled with tears. A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. He reached out and gently touched the most prominent scar on her shoulder, his fingers tracing its path as if it were a line of sacred scripture. "You are fire," he said, his voice thick with an emotion so profound it was almost a sob. Not what it burned. She smiled, a slow, radiant smile that seemed to light up the darkness. She took his hand and pressed it to her heart, so he could feel its strong, steady beat. "Then hold me," she whispered, her voice a seductive, joyful invitation. "Like you are not afraid of burning." He pulled her to him then, and their love, which had been born from the cold ashes of tragedy, finally blazed into a wildfire. But it was not a fire of destruction. It was a fire that spread warmth and light, a fire of fierce, defiant strength, of improbable survival, and of a passion that had been chosen, fought for, and won. Sometime later, she stood alone at the edge of their land, looking out across the wild, rolling hills that stretched to the horizon, bathed in the pale light of dawn. The land was harsh and unforgiving. It took and it took, but what it gave back, it gave forever. She ran a hand over the familiar, textured skin of her arm. The scars were a part of her, as much as her own heartbeat. She was not the girl who had almost been broken by this place. She was a woman who had been forged by it. She took a deep breath of the cool morning air, a whisper of a smile on her lips. "This land did not break me. she said to the rising sun. It made me. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. Please feel free to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. And we invite you to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.